Hi, I'm Holly Kovo from Fitting Fitness In. I'm a personal trainer and nutrition specialist, and welcome to Get Healthy with Holly. On today's episode, it's all about the squash, We have 13 different types of squash I'm going to talk to you about today. Do you know there are so many different types? I mean, there's way more than 13, way more than you realize. And when I was doing research, I was like, oh my gosh, so many. And I went to Idlewild in Acton, of course, and I knew I could get a great variety, and I did. Look at this. Did you know that squash is considered a fruit? That's right. It's considered a fruit because it contains seeds and it comes from the flowering part of the plant. And there are other fruits that are treated like vegetables, like tomatoes, eggplants, and cucumbers. So these are technically fruits. We're going to talk today about the different types of squash. And we have summer squash that are soft and more, the skin is edible. And summer squash are brighter. These we have a zucchini and a yellow summer squash. They can be eaten raw, they can be grilled, they can even be pickled. And winter squash actually is grown in the summer, but it gets their name because they can stay longer into the winter. They last longer into the winter. And the winter squash have tougher exteriors and they last long. You don't need to refrigerate them, but you do need to keep them in a cool, dry place. So I have currently about 10 different acorn squashes sitting in my garage, along with a few butternut squashes and some honey nut squashes as well. And that's where we store them in our garage. So when you're going to select a winter squash, which are these winter squashes, you want to make sure you choose some squash that is firm, that has no blemishes, that doesn't have any soft spots, and that the stem is still kind of tan, and that you know that it's still in good shape. So these are all the different winter squashes, and I'm going to make a couple recipes using winter squashes today. So again, this is the zucchini squash, which is a summer squash, and the yellow squash. They both are fresh, sweet, and tender. They kind of taste a lot alike. The yellow squash, you have two different types of varieties. You have the crooked neck and you have the straight neck. They taste the same, they're just shaped differently. And then we have our winter squashes. So let's start with our acorn squash. This is an acorn squash. It's a very popular winter squash. It resembles an enormous acorn. The flesh inside is orange and the skin is a little more ribbed, green, and it does fade into orange at a certain point. It's very simple to prepare. You can slice it in half, you clean it out, maybe you put a little butter on it or a little olive oil, which is what I do, and you put it in the oven and bake it or roast it. And then you actually eat right out of the shell. You can stuff it. As a matter of fact, in the second segment of this show, I'm going to make a recipe using the acorn squash. And then we have the amber cup squash. Look at that. It kind of looks like a pumpkin, doesn't it? It has a much different flavor though. They're orange on the inside and outside, and they're very, very sweet. So the texture and flavor is similar to that of the acorn squash or the kabocha squash, which I'll get into in a minute. And these are best baked. And then we have the butternut squash, which is very popular, and most people know about the butternut squash. Very similar in appearance to the the buttercup squash right here. This is buttercup. It's very similar in appearance to the kabocha squash, and it is a little squatty, a little green, has orange flesh, and it's best to be roasted or baked, because then it's best to be mashed, or you can even stuff it. Once you bake it, you can stuff it. Like most of these, you can stuff them. And then we have the butternut squash, which is very popular, and most people know about the butternut squash. It's very sweet, orange flesh, smooth outside, very popular to prepare it with baking, simmering, braising, and even steaming. What I like to do with the butternut squash is I peel it, I cut it into about 1-inch cubes, I put it in a sheet pan, I spray a little olive oil and some rosemary on there, and then I roast it. And they come out delicious, nice and sweet. The delicata squash, I'm going to be cooking with that today. Look how pretty that is. Isn't that very nice? It is the pale yellow with those telltale green striping, and it has a tasty yellow flesh, typically prepared by baking, frying, braising, or steaming. Also called a sweet potato squash because it is so sweet. And then we have the honey nut squash, which is this guy. And he looks just like a miniature butternut squash, but he's so sweet. We have several of these. My husband's sister, Sally, has a farm, and she gives us a lot of different types of squash. That is really awesome. It's very, very sweet, very much like the butternut squash. And then we have the Hubbard squash. Well, this is a popular squash for boiling and mashing or pureeing. It's very big, a very thick shell. It's bumpy. The inside is bright orange to a deep green. I will show you that because I got this at Idlewild. They had already cut it and cleaned it out for me. And that's good because it's a very hard shell. Then we have the sweet dumpling squash. Look at that. Isn't that cute? Anyway, it's about the size of an apple. It resembles kind of like a pumpkin. It's multicolored. I love that. It's not just for decorations. It's very sweet and tender inside, and it makes ideal for stuffing with meats or grains and cheeses, even other vegetables. So you cut it and you roast it, and then you can stuff it. You can pretty much stuff most of these. And then we have the spaghetti squash. Yes, this is a spaghetti squash. And why do we call it spaghetti squash? Because once it's cooked and you take a fork and you start peeling away, it comes away in strands like spaghetti strands. And you can use it instead of pasta, which is a great alternative to pasta, especially if you're a diabetic. It's great because there's a lot less carbs. So you can bake it, you can roast it, you can put it in casseroles. It's awesome. And this is the kabuka squash. It looks a lot like the acorn squash, but it's not. It's a Japanese squash. It's very sweet and dense, and it's good for stuffing or for mashing and for baked goods and even in soups if you're going to do squash in a soup. And then we have the sugar pumpkin. Yes, pumpkins are squashes. And it's not just for decoration in the fall, but the sugar pumpkins are really great for pies, of course, breads, muffins, cupcakes, soups, and so much more. That's our pumpkin. So these are all our different squashes. It's all about the squash today. And so in today's episode, I'm going to make a recipe using the delicata squash, and I'm going to make a dip as well. But let me just go over 4 different ways that you can cook these squashes. You can bake the squash. If you're going to bake it at 350 in the oven, depending on how big the squash is. It's pretty much 30 to 40 minutes. You can roast them in the oven at 400 degrees. Once you roast them and you let them cool off, you can freeze them then and put them in a nice freezer bag, get all the air out as much as possible, and then they'll stay good for a couple months in the freezer. You can boil these squashes, or you can microwave squash, these winter squashes. You want to cut them in half, remove all the seeds and the pulp, and then microwave on high 7 minutes per pound. So per pound, 7 minutes in the microwave. 4 different ways that you can cook these squashes. I highly encourage you to try a different squash. I know we kind of stick with the summer squash or maybe the butternut squash and the acorn squash. Try something different and you'll be surprised. Okay, so our roasted delicata squash with a dip. I'm gonna make the dip first. I'm making a Basil Aioli, and I'm making that first because once I make it, I want to stick it in the fridge and let the flavors kind of chill and work together, formulate together, and then I'll make the delicata squash. So I am using, it calls for 1.5 cups of mayonnaise, so I am using the Hellmann's light mayonnaise, which is light in calories and in fat. I hope it tastes okay. I've got a lot of basil and some garlic, so that'll help with the taste. And so we have 2/3 cup of basil. It calls for a tablespoon of fresh chopped garlic. Those of you who know me, I'm not a big garlic fan, so I have just used a teaspoon instead of a tablespoon. It calls for a tablespoon of lemon juice and 1.5 teaspoons of lemon zest. So I have my lemon, I have my zester, and I'm gonna do some zest. I used a lemon that I had zested the other day to get that juice because once you zest it, I don't want to waste it. And zesting, you just scrape along the outside, just getting the yellow part of the lemon. And boy, it just adds so much more taste when you use zest, lemon zest. After a while, you get to figure out what looks right, what the amount. We're going to be blending this, so I'm going to take the mayonnaise. This is going to be a good test for me. I have never used this Ninja before. This is a lot of dip. We're going to make it, because the squash that I'm making is going to be kind of like an appetizer. And yeah, squash for appetizer. That's different, isn't it? And then you can also, anything left over, you can use it on a sandwich. So I'm going to combine the mayonnaise and the basil. This is 2/3 cup of basil, chopped basil. I love chopping basil because it smells so good. Now, put the top on, then you put it in upside down. Okay. You can see that green color is coming up. Now, let me take this out, and I have to add the garlic. We'll process it for a little while with the garlic. This is a little messy. And then we add the lemon and the lemon zest. Lemon juice, lemon zest. Let me see if I can get that white out. One last mix. There we go. It is such a nice green, that basil. Oh my gosh, it smells great. Look at that. Green. And then I'm going to put this in the refrigerator and we'll let it chill for up to an hour. So now I'm going to roast the delicata squash. So let's start by taking a little bit of the ends off. Now, it's a very hard squash, so you need a sharp knife that can do it. You have to kind of work your way down, kind of rock back and forth with it. Woo, that was hard. All right, so now the same with cutting it. Kind of make a little score along one of these lines, and then get your knife in there and rock back and forth. Now, I will say I brought my knife from home because I like a heavy knife and it's sharp. Here we go. That's the delicata squash. And that's how you cut it. Now we just want to clean out all of the pulp and seeds. Here we go. Now, I have a smaller one, but that's okay because this, again, is going to be an appetizer. That's something different in itself, isn't it? Squash as an appetizer. We're thinking outside the box today, my friends. We're trying new things. We're trying new squash. There's so many out there. Again, I got all these different squashes at Idlewild in Acton. I knew I could find it there. And their stuff is always so fresh. Getting a little bit of workout at the same time. Okay, good. We have that. Let me just clean this off in the garbage here. Okay, so we are going to cut about 3/8 inches. You don't want it too thick because you want them to cook easily and you don't want them to be too big because, again, it's an appetizer. There we go. I use a little extra with my other hand. I may just cut half of this because you want them to be laid out single file on the pan. And I want to make sure I have enough room in that pan. So you stick them in this bowl. So we're going to put a teaspoon of olive oil in here, and this is my mixing bowl because I like to shake it up. So, or a tablespoon actually, tablespoon of olive oil. Some salt. Calls for about a teaspoon of salt. That's about a teaspoon. And then cayenne pepper. Gives it a little spice, a little kick. That's up to you how much you put in. I'm just going to put a little bit in. I don't want it to make it too hot. I want people to be able to eat it. All right, then I cover it up and mix it around. Here we go. Woo! Look at that. Nice. So we're going to lay them out on the pan. Hey, if I can fit more on there, then I'll do the other part of the squash. Looks like I might be able to. That's fine with me. The more the merrier. I love to feed the staff. They're the crew here. Woo. Okay, so the oven I have preheating to 450 degrees. I'm going to put it in there. You can use parchment paper on this if you want, or a silicone mat. We didn't have that today, but that's fine. So then we're going to put it in there. We're going to heat it for 12 to 18 minutes. You can flip it over, but let's put it in there for about 15 minutes and see how we do. And I just pulled the delicata squash out of the oven. It was in the oven at 450. I had it in there for 15 minutes. You use a little fork to see if it's soft, and it is. So I pulled it out. And now I'm just going to plate it up here. Because again, this is an appetizer. And the skin has softened as well. Now you can put more cayenne pepper on it if you want. I tend to go a little lighter on the spices because you just never know. Oh, look at how great, how colorful. I should just flip them over. Because that's the other side is what got nice and dark. And we have our Basil Aioli, which thickened up quite nicely in the refrigerator. And we will dip our delicata squash in the aioli, and that'll be our little appetizer. So thinking outside the box, squash for an appetizer as opposed to a side, squash for a meal, any one of these different squashes. Push yourself outside the box, push yourself outside the comfort zone. Don't just cook an acorn squash or a butternut squash or even a spaghetti squash. Try some of these other squashes and be creative. And here we have it. Today we're going to cook stuffed acorn squash, and we're using as many things from my garden as possible. So we're going to start with these nice acorn squashes. Now I've already cut them and cleaned them out. You want to make sure that you cut a little bit on the bottom, not too much that you go too far into the flesh of the acorn squash, because you want, once it cooks, you don't want it to get mushy, but just enough so it will stand on its own in the pan. So we're going to start out by putting these in the oven. We're going to spray a little bit of olive oil on them. I usually like to use the spray because that minimizes how much oil you use, but it still gets enough on there. And we're going to cook it at 375 for 20 minutes upright, and then I flip them over. Then we'll flip them over and cook them for another 20 minutes down, face on the pan. All right, so let me get these in the oven. So now while the acorn squash is cooking, we're going to make the mixture that's going to go inside. So let me start with powering on, and we are going to start with some onions and peppers. So we're going to do a couple teaspoons or tablespoons of olive oil. I'm kind of winging it a little bit. And then we'll start with onions and peppers. Get those cooking a little bit. We'll cook them just a little bit till they're a little tender, and then we'll add some more stuff in there. So the peppers are from our garden. The onions were not. We didn't grow onions this year, but we have sweet potatoes that we're going to put in there. Those are from our garden. Cherry tomatoes, also from our garden. Some spinach, although I was going to do kale from our garden, but I was running out of time today, and so if I did the kale, I'd have to get it, clean it, chop it. But if you're using kale, I would sprinkle it with some lemon juice first to kind of cut that bitterness, and then use that. But today we're going to use spinach, which is a nice, little sweeter. Some mushrooms. This is quinoa, and I did red and white quinoa. I kind of like that. It's a little more festive. The cherry tomatoes, we're going to do some feta cheese. We're going to chop up some walnuts and, again, some dried cranberries, because we know from our last episode how great those are for you. So let's get this cooking. And, of course, another colorful meal. All right, so let me cut these cherry tomatoes. I'm just cutting them in half. Boy, these are very ripe, these tomatoes. We had to bring our tomatoes in while they were green because the chipmunks are eating them, and they're Boy, I'll tell you, they're kind of like putting it in our face because they're taking them out, they're eating everything inside the skin, and then they're leaving the skin on our back porch. Oh my gosh, they are really giving it to my husband. It's kind of like Elmer J. Fudd with the rabbit, with this chipmunk, but there's also a groundhog out there that's doing a job on the garden too, I'll tell you. But what can you do? They need to eat too. I feel for the farmers when they have animals messing with their stuff. All right, while we're waiting for those to cook, just doing a good job in there. Yeah, I don't want it to overcook. So now I'm going to put in the sweet potatoes. Now, I mean, I can give you amounts. That's probably a little bit more than a cup, but that's up to you because all you need to do is look what you have in the cabinet or in the refrigerator and use that. So you may want to put in a little bit more sweet potatoes. I'm going to put in the mushrooms at the same time. Try to cook them down. Maybe a tiny bit more olive oil. There we go. So spinach doesn't take long to cook. We know that it cooks down very quickly into very little amount. So that's going to be one of the last things that we put in, as well as the cranberries and the walnuts and the tomatoes. And the feta will be last. So you want to chop those sweet potatoes into small pieces. I probably could have gone even smaller, but let's see how this works. And in the meantime, I'm going to chop up my walnuts because I don't want them this big. And just bring it across, keeping my hand on the top of the blade and just go right across the nuts. Sometimes you may want to put in a little bit of vegetable stock or chicken stock. I'm putting a little bit in here just to keep everything moist. You don't want the vegetables to get dried. And because these pieces of sweet potato are a little bigger, it's going to take a little bit longer to saute. But while you're working on this, the acorn squash is cooking. 20 minutes on one side, 20 minutes on the other. You could always keep them just face down, you know, with the bowl part down. But I like to cook them with it open first and then flip them. Let me get the top on there. That'll keep the moisture in while that's cooking. So quinoa, I really like quinoa because it's a carb, but it also has protein. And you know, I used to do the white quinoa all the time, and then I would chop up some pistachio nuts and put that in there along with some fresh thyme, and that would be my quinoa. I would also do that with rice to make it a little bit more interesting. But then when I found the red quinoa, I was like, wow, this is much better. But when you just do the red, I found that that wasn't as satisfying either. So I combine the two, and not only does it look cool and better, but it tastes pretty good too. It's a great form of carbohydrate because it is protein as well. I tend to use the spray olive oils when I want to just minimize how much oil you put on there, because you can't always control it when you're using a bottle. I've already cooked the quinoa in my rice cooker this morning. So when I was looking at different recipes online, someone said that they cooked their quinoa and the cranberries together and just put a little half a cup of water more in. So I did that this morning in the rice cooker. That didn't come out well. It came out mushy. Instead of, they said that the cranberries are nice and plump, but it came out mushy. So I had to clean out the rice cooker and quick make another batch. And so that's what this is. And quite frankly, I kind of enjoy the little chewiness of the cranberry in the mixture because it's something different. And then you have a little bit of crunch with the walnuts. I love spinach too. I have spinach often. That's why I have always a big container that I get from the grocery store already washed because it's easy. But I throw that in my eggs. If I'm going to have eggs in the morning, I'll have 2 egg whites to 1 yolk. And that way I reduce the cholesterol and the more of the calories. And I'll throw in some cherry tomatoes while we have them from the garden. So I'll have that But I'll also put in here, I kind of think it sweetens it up a little bit. Let's do that. Again, anytime if you need to put a little bit more of the vegetable stock or chicken stock, this today is going to be total vegetarian, but you could also dice up some grilled chicken to put on there as well. So now, again, on my website, I'll have the recipe and I'll give some amounts for everything, but it's really up to you how much you want of the quinoa versus the sweet potato versus everything else, because it's your taste. And it's what you have in the refrigerator that you want to use. I'm all about cleaning out the fridge, making sure you use everything in your fridge. I'm gonna add that last. Let's put the spinach in there now. And keep in mind, the acorn squash is in the oven. So it may seem like that's a long time, but while that's cooking, you're sauteing all of this yummy stuff. Look at how colorful it is. Once again, Holly makes a colorful meal. I just love color. Although today's apron may not show a lot of color, it does show I have a good spine though, doesn't it? You know, you gotta have a little fun. And my aprons are my fun part. All right, now I'll throw these in. Cover this up for a few minutes. Acorn squash is almost done. Actually, you know what? I'll also put a little salt and pepper in there. And that's up to you, how much you put in or whether you put it in or not. You could even put some other herbs in there, maybe basil, thyme. But I just think there's so many flavors in there now. It doesn't really need a lot more. And then we'll just top it with the feta cheese. Of course, you could go with a shredded cheddar cheese as well, because you're just going to top it. Let's put these in there now. So this is about 1/4 cup. Again, it's up to you how much you want to put in. If you really want to have, you know, a cranberry taste. I think that's probably enough. And you don't have to use dried cranberries if you don't have them. That's fine. So let me pull the acorn squash out of the oven. Look at those acorn squash. They cooked up really nice, didn't they? Nice little golden flavor. Wow, you couldn't get any better than that, I'll tell you. That worked out well. All right, so let me grab a couple plates. We'll plate this up. Put that there. And we'll plate up this next one. Look at that. Look at how colorful that is. Isn't that awesome? Look at this. Isn't this delicious looking? I just love it. All right, now I'm gonna need a bigger spoon to fill them. And we'll start with this. Of course, you fill it however much you want to fill it. You can even have some on the outside if you want a little more. And we'll fill this other one. Now again, you could put some grilled chicken in this as well. I would grill it ahead of time and then put it on the side. Here we go. If there's not enough in there. Let's just get a little color on the top of that one. Here we go. Now, you use as much feta as you would like. Or not. I'm just going to put a little on here. All right. And we have leftovers for more if you want to make more, or you can use it on spaghetti squash as well. We do spaghetti squash in the oven and then cook it first, and then we put all different things like ground beef and make it an Italian or a taco spaghetti squash. You could use this in the spaghetti squash as well. So these are our stuffed acorn squash, all using most vegetables from the garden, and it's a great fall dinner. And you can add some grilled chicken, as I mentioned earlier, if you want a little more protein. So this recipe will be up on my website, fittingfitnessin.com, and I want to thank you for joining me today and look forward to seeing you next time on Get Healthy with Holly.